What's up, everybody? We're back. Chapter 3 of Roar. Actually, yesterday, the revised edition came out, so we've got that updated. It's a much thicker book. There's a lot more kind of tidbits inside of it. But Chapter 3, Moving Through Menopause. The end of your periods isn't the end of the line. I've actually found this chapter pretty dope because the average woman that we train in the gym is either just starting to flirt with menopause, in the middle of it, or has gone through it. And I've already had some, like this morning I had a conversation with Beth around some changes that she could make nutritionally based off of what Stacy's saying in this book, because she's not happy with kind of her body composition at this point. And to recomp, so body recomposition, gain lean mass, lose fat is kind of what recomp means, is different strategies for success with a postmenopausal woman. So that was like kind of cool. What were any big highlights that you ran into that you were like, that's dope?
I read a lot into the body compositional changes as well, just because that's a really common topic here in a gym setting, especially with our clientele, and just being able to explain a little bit more in depth why it happens, rather than just saying like, oh, you're not eating enough protein, or you're taking in too many calories, or we just need to train harder. But being able to give them some more like actionable information, like Stacy talks about in the book, as far as changing even just like the glycemic index of some of the carbohydrates you're bringing in. So rather than just thinking carbs, energy, train hard, the source of those carbs can make a difference.
Totally. And then that was one thing we talked about was like, you still need carbohydrates, but you want to get lower glycemic index, lower glycemic load. And she'd never heard of that. So it was a trigger for a good conversation. She's like, oh, that makes sense. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, maybe you should explain what is glycemic index to people who don't know.
I don't want to butcher it. So glycemic index is essentially after you eat a food, how much your blood sugar rises and how much insulin is released. So lower glycemic index, lower glycemic load foods will cause a more subtle or a more gradual increase in blood sugar. So if you think fruits and vegetables, those are good, almost all of them, low glycemic index, low glycemic load carbohydrates, where your pastas, your white breads, your sugars, like just straight sugar, those are going to be really high glycemic index, really high glycemic load. If you I lost my train of thought. But if you end up eating breads and you're like, I really like those, if you hit sourdough bread, that's one thing Stacy talks about, like fermented breads, that's going to lower the glycemic load of that. So looking at sourdough and fermented options is a good move. Would you pull up?
Yeah, and honestly, like you can go on Google and you can just search glycemic index chart, and tons of options will come on here, and where like your typical carbohydrate based foods will fall in a GI scale, just because it's probably not a commonly used term. Often you'll just hear people talk about simple sugars and complex sugars, or whatever term they use. So if you're curious what your typical food looks like on that chart, it's an easy Google.
Yeah, totally. That's good beta. Another takeaway I had was menopause can take a decade. I honestly didn't know that at all. I thought it was like a 2-year thing. So I'm in my 30s. My mom has gone through that, and you can kind of tell when she was going through it, right? And having some of this information available would have been really good for her. I was actually talking to her yesterday, and she was like, oh, send me the book. I want to read that. So
that's cool.
Project is already a success because I helped my mom.
yeah, for sure. I remember very specifically when my mom started going through some of this.
Yeah.
And especially like the couple of years leading up to it, and her not being able to sleep and having hot flashes, and it just like completely changed her mood.
Yeah. And the cool thing is that is something that we can watch for and then make changes nutritionally and how we train to make that whole experience less of a roller coaster ride. And you can kind of stabilize it with good choices. So the typical age for menopause is between 48 and 55, but it can be before that. I'm not sure how often it occurs after that, but I haven't heard of that too often. And then post-menopausal women have a harder time metabolizing fructose than those still in reproductive years. So the takeaway is if you're an endurance athlete or you're out for a hike or skiing all day, just a longer activity where you're exercising and fueling at the same time, you want to make sure your drink, your gels, your goos, your blocks are glucose-based, not fructose-based, especially if you've gone through menopause, because your body is less efficient at breaking down the fructose and then using that. So you end up pooling more water to the stomach, and it can cause GI distress. And that's a very common thing in endurance athletes once they're kind of in those menopausal years. And a simple thing is switching from fructose-based to glucose-based, and it tells you right on the label, will prevent that. I didn't know that at all.
No, I don't think I knew that either. And you know, anytime you're redirecting blood flow and basically just think of it in terms of like energy resources towards your gut during competition, that means there's less available for the working tissue. So that's the reason a lot of those kind of like in-race fueling substances are supposed to be fast digestible things. So if you're letting, you know, fructose-based supplements stay in your GI tract, then that's only going to hurt performance.
100%. I thought that was like a really good action item. And a common thing that came up was menopausal and postmenopausal women need to have around 15 grams of protein within an hour before training, and then you got to get a minimum of 30 grams of protein within 30 minutes post-training, and that will help your recovery immensely. It's harder for a menopausal, postmenopausal woman to recover than most other segments of the population. So just making that adjustment, there's been a lot of success in case studies of improved performance, feel better, and just everything's better. So do it.
No, I thought that was interesting too. My background being more in the sports science side of things, a common metric you look at with high-level athletes is like a testosterone cortisol level, or some sort of a ratio that's basically trying to give you an idea of training strain and recovery, and it can be used as an indication of overtraining in the long term. And Stacy goes into some of the changes in hormone levels, especially in menopause and postmenopause, and one of the things she talks about is changes in cortisol and DHEA. And DHEA, I'm not going to try to say that. Most people just call it the acronym, but it's basically a precursor to androgens and testosterone specifically. It also regulates the effects of cortisol. So when you have drops in DHEA, it's, in my head, basically a big shift in kind of that general marker of testosterone cortisol ratios. So prioritizing recovery, especially in specific windows, pre and post, in menopausal women is huge, not just because of like get protein in so you can start recovery, but there are specific hormonal changes that are making it harder.
Correct. And so what happens with DHEA after menopause? How is it different?
So DHEA levels drop substantially, my understanding at least. And because those regulate the effects of cortisol, then you are basically going to have changes in energy balance, because cortisol can be a catabolic type hormone. You also have drops in estrogen, which can lead to insulin insensitivity. So there are a lot of compounding factors just based on that time period.
And the increased protein helps negate those hormonal changes.
Exactly. And I think one of the big take-home messages in this part of the chapter that Stacy writes about is that there is a large drop in the protein synthesis to protein breakdown ratio once you go through menopause. So it's harder not only to build muscle, but even just to save the lean mass you have. So you have to be really intentional about how you fuel and how you recover.
And a side note on that is your body is pretty much always, I believe it's always, either catabolic or anabolic, meaning catabolic breaking down muscle tissue and skeletal tissue, or anabolic building up muscle tissue, skeletal tissue. When protein breakdown increases, that means your catabolic rate is higher. And once you hit menopause, it is higher. So that is where you have to put more proteins in the system so that they get pushed out to your musculoskeletal system. The reason the amounts of protein are significant is your internal organs keep you alive, your musculoskeletal system keeps you healthy. So if you're not getting enough protein, your internal organs will steal, if you want to say steal in quotes, amino acids from your muscles and your skeletal system just to keep your heart working, keep your liver working, keep your kidneys going. So you have to clear and satisfy all of the organs that are keeping you alive to make sure those have the amino acids that they need, and that's what proteins are. And once you clear that, then you can get pushed out, and it's even harder for that to occur when you're postmenopausal. That's why the protein timing, part of the reason protein timing becomes really important.
Yeah. Did she talk about leucine thresholds in chapter 3?
I can't remember if that's chapter 3 or a podcast I listened to, but let's talk about it.
Let's just touch on it briefly.
Yeah.
So leucine is a BCAA, branched chain amino acid. There's been a lot of talk in recent years just in general around training and BCAAs, if the supplements are useful, if not. But most of the research I've read is focused on leucine and that it can be an upstream trigger of mTOR, and we'll skip all the names and acronyms, but basically it can start the process of protein synthesis once you hit a certain threshold level. And that's something I'm pretty sure Stacy talks about it in this book, but I don't remember specifically what chapter, that women specifically should look to hit that leucine threshold to try to jumpstart this anabolic process in and around training windows. I think that threshold is roughly 2.5 to 3 grams of leucine, if I'm not incorrect. So I know that she has advocated for menopausal women including BCAA supplements within their diet.
And that all makes sense. There was a cool study that came out this week. I read kind of the abstract of. It was about leucine thresholds. If you're eating meat regularly, you will hit it. If you're vegan, vegetarian, it makes sense to have the BCAAs and make sure there's leucine in it. Almost all of them do. And that'll hit your threshold. So,
basically it speaks to the quality of the protein you're eating too.
Correct.
So you have to make sure that you have all of your essential amino acids, your BCAAs involved, and if you can get those from whole protein sources throughout your diet, then most likely you'll reach those thresholds. But BCAA supplements are an easy way to ensure you can get that if you're not going to have full feeding in and around training.
Correct. And then touching on protein and the difference between men and women is, for men, on average, if you're not a new person to training, protein timing really doesn't matter because our hormonal makeup is different, where protein timing really does matter for women. So if you're looking at the literature, most of the literature is based off of men's data. So you will hear people say protein timing doesn't matter, and it doesn't for dudes. But for women, it does matter, and that's one of the biggest takeaways from listening to podcasts that Stacy's on and reading this book is protein is one of those top 3 things you need to focus on to keep things rocking.
Even in my graduate nutrition courses, I remember we had a debate class one time talking about whether or not there truly is kind of that idea of an anabolic window post-training. And to sum it all up, the research really pointed to the fact that the benchmark goal is simply hit your protein needs for the day. And don't worry about timing until you have everything else dialed in. And I actually read a paper comparing bolus feedings of say 100 grams of protein compared to 4 feedings of 25 grams. And basically the conclusion was that there was not a statistical difference in the long run. But my take has always been that for men or women, if you can more frequently start the recovery process and keep those things being digested over time, is probably more effective. Stacy has backed that up in her recommendation specifically for women.
Correct. If you have your thumb on the beat of kind of the Instagram nutrition world, Lane Norton, smart dude, he just did a review of a study that intermittent fasting and fasting makes sense, and it does for dudes. It doesn't for women. That's a future. I'm pretty sure that's chapter 5. So we'll hit it. Moving on, takeaways. So adjusting carbs to sit lower on the glycemic index. That is a super easy thing to Google, and you'll get giant lists, color-coded, all sorts of stuff. Include more fat and protein in training and racing foods. I thought that was really interesting. The general recommendations are during training, carbohydrates. You're not getting fats, you're not getting protein, because again, you don't want resources going to the gut to break down the food. women will do better with a little bit of fat and a little bit of protein in their training food. So if you have a 3-hour training session or you're out in the mountains for 3 hours, making sure you have a mix and not just carbohydrates will do a lot better, especially for menopausal women. Sleep supplements for menopausal women, because sleep can become an issue. Controlling temperature in the room matters. So that's one of the first things that you can adjust. I forget what the temperature is. I think it's like 65 degrees or lower is
roughly.
optimal. Like in our house, we got a little baby girl, so the heat's gone up. It's at 68 at night, but our room, all the windows are open, so it's like in the 50s in there.
Oh wow,
it's good. It's real good. So melatonin is an option. It's not Stacy's favorite option, but sleep is more important than not sleep, so that's a good thing to try. And I can't say the word Montemorency, the cherry juice, tart cherry juice. It's high in melatonin and anti-inflammatory. And so having an ice cold glass 30 minutes before bed can help start kind of that circadian rhythm, and drinking cold fluids can help you kind of regulate your body temperature, your core body temperature. Yeah, so you need to get that core temp low enough, and that's what will allow you to sleep well. The other thing that she talked about that was a good thing to try is valerian root tea. It improves sleep, helps you fall asleep faster, and can complement melatonin. So if you're doing both, you kind of get the fall asleep, stay asleep, hit a deep sleep kind of cycle. And there was another one that I was not familiar with, which is black cohosh tea, which can help with hot flashes. So that is something to look into. And then after menopause, women sweat less and feel less thirst, which increases core body temperature. There's a study she references where they had still reproductively active women and then menopausal women train at the same time, and they're looking at sweat rates. And the menopausal women, their core body temperature is significantly higher. I forget how much, but they're warmer to start with. The reproductively active, so younger women, started sweating beforehand and were thirsty sooner, where postmenopausal women weren't getting the signals of sweat or thirst, but they needed more hydration than the reproductively active. So my takeaway from that was you need to consistently prehydrate. That is something she talks about. You need to make sure you're moving into your training well hydrated, and then be diligent about getting hydration kind of throughout your training session.
Yeah, and
she also
she also talks about, similar to like trying to control temperature at bedtime, pre-cooling as an option. So if you are prehydrating with something before training, make it cold.
And that's even more important if you're training in Florida than in July than training in Park City in December. Right, so like paying attention to that. For hydrating, just drinking water is not hydrating. That is something that comes up several times. So adding 1/16 of a teaspoon of salt per 20 ounces of water. So you can do that yourself. You can get Noon, Element. There's so many different electrolyte things. But if you're a menopausal woman, make sure there's not fructose in it. Make sure it's glucose if it is sweetened. Some of them aren't sweetened. And then this was a note that I think is important just to discuss. And then the takeaway is like get help for it. But perimenopausal women are 3 times more likely to experience depression than the population at whole. Or if you look at the whole population. So if you are kind of around those menopausal years and you're noticing some depression, like that, it's worth noting like it can be a menopausal related thing, and then get some help for that. If you make the adjustments with your training and nutrition, that can definitely help, right? It can help mood. Being physically active is one of the best things to battle depression, but it's good to know that that's a real thing that a lot of women experience, and then you can make decisions and make actions based on that information.
Absolutely.
I thought this was cool because I tell everybody to take it anyway, but beta-alanine can help as a vasodilator to enhance blood circulation during exercise. Menopausal women are not as good at circulating blood during exercise, so just take beta-alanine. The recommended is usually like 4.2 grams per day. Just take it every day. I have not seen any negatives from supplementing beta-alanine.
No, I haven't read much as far as a negative downside for it.
Yeah, there's a clear upside. I take it every day because I'm trying to be stronger. And I'll do anything I can to help. Cooling post-exercise is a great way to facilitate blood flow for recovery. So cool towels, ice baths. We'll talk about ice baths later. They don't have to be as cold for ladies as they do for chicks. You start sweating later in the workout. We kind of talked about that. Focus on your hydration and prehydration. You have a greater sensitivity to carbs as a menopausal woman. So fuel with carbs, fat, and protein as opposed to just carbs, and you won't get that insulin spike and that high blood sugar spike, which creates downstream problems if you do that consistently. We talked about the protein timing, and I had a note that having protein prior to bed, so eating within 2 hours of going to bed can have a negative effect on sleep and getting into deep sleep. So make sure you're eating dinner kind of in that 3 to 2 hours before bedtime, and make sure there's enough protein in it. It's kind of the takeaway there. And then after menopause, you have less power production. It's an unfortunate reality. You can still get more power. You can maintain the power you have. If you're a world-class athlete and all the way up until you hit menopause and you're like one of the most powerful chicks out there, you'll probably drop a little bit. For most women that we see, they haven't realized their full genetic potential. So even once you hit menopause, you have to train power. And Alex, how do you train power? I think that's worth talking about.
Yeah, I think it depends what it looks like based on your training style. So you can train power on a bike. You can train it running. You can train it doing plyometrics. You can train it with weight training. But in general, the rule is that it needs to be explosive, right? So we are trying to produce a high level of force in a very short amount of time. So if you're thinking of weight training, that might look like doing explosive movements like medicine ball throws or speed squats. If you're doing plyometrics, you might be doing box jumps or bounding. If you're on a bike, you might be doing high intensity intervals, trying to really increase your pedal rate and put some like a higher power output on the bike. But in general, we need to make sure that your highs are high as far as training goes, and then you also think about recovery in the lows.
And a general set rep scheme for power athlete that we're working with would be you do 6 medicine ball throws as hard as you can, and then chill for 45 seconds to a minute, and then do the other side. And you're going to do 5 or 6 sets of 3 to 5 reps. And so when you train power, you're not getting real sweaty. You're not getting real out of breath. You're just working on moving something quickly.
So if you're training power, make sure your rest intervals are long enough. You should feel recovered by the time you start your next set.
Perfect. And I think that is a good kind of conversation around menopause. Stacy also has a book. I don't know what it's called. I haven't read it yet, but specifically around training for menopausal women. So that would be worth checking out. Sweet. Thanks for joining, guys. See you next week with Chapter 4.